Welcome to this episode of The Square. I'm really excited for several different reasons. The first is, as you can tell, we're back in the office, and we had mentioned a few weeks ago we were slowly going to be transitioning back, and now we are, and I'm really excited. That also means that with the whole team that is behind The Square, we can go to doing our original concept of having a variety of hosts. The only reason why I've been hosting the last several episodes is because I happen to have the gear at my house. And so over the next several weeks on a variety of topics, you'll see different hosts because The Square is not about one person. It's certainly not about me. It's about human-centric thought leadership and design. I'm also really excited because I'm here with Unmesh Kelkar, who is our Corgan Explore winner for this year. And just to give you a little history, Corgan Explore has been going on for nearly 15 years, and it's an opportunity for Corgan to pay for one person to go and do research and design outside the office. So whether that's in country or overseas, they're able to dig into and do research on design principles and behavior and how we can really improve our practice. As part of that, you're going to be going to 4 different countries looking and researching this topic of design. So let's just start off a little bit by giving me a little bit of background on why you're an architect.
So really, when I was a kid, we used to make things, and one of the things we used to make was fortresses. So we would go out and look at places where there were fortresses. There were like lots of hills, and on top of that you will have walls and stuff, and come back and start making miniature models of those. And then I started realizing how hard it is to make things, and obviously it didn't look that good. But eventually even now, I have those struggles. We are making stuff all the time. We are drawing, really clearing up our intent. And whenever I look at good, well-designed public spaces, it really excites me. And I'm curious about how they are designed and how they're maintained and stuff like that.
So Unmesh, tell me a little bit about what attracted you to the Corgan Explore competition.
Oh, this was amazing. I mean, when I came as an intern in 2017, as an intern, you can't apply for this travel study. But at that time, I had that in my mind, and I had seen one of the presentations actually happening, and I was really inspired that people would go out in like cities like Copenhagen and like many cities in Europe, and really like study the places in detail and come back and present it to the whole firm. And I thought that was such an amazing opportunity to go to a place and really investigate it with a critical eye. And I really wanted to do that. So when I came back to Corgan as a full-time intern, I wanted to do it. And it was just a perfect timing for me to write that proposal. I was just out of my school, so there was a little bit of hangover of all the school study and writing and all that. So it was really good.
So I know that you're an architecture intern on the Aviation team. Why Urbanism Lite? What is it about that topic that fascinates you? And really, tell me a little bit about what it is.
Yeah, so this is not like a very famous term. It's a made-up idea, actually. To be very honest, it was only mentioned once or twice in one of the essays by Rem Koolhaas. The essay he wrote was called Whatever Happened to Urbanism, and the whole point of the essay was to kind of encourage designers to go on this path of experimentation and thinking about provisional sort of urbanistic ideas, city-making ideas, because it was written in 1995, so there were lots of new cities getting built, and he was of the opinion that they shouldn't be built on older ideals, like very, very ancient cities. They're very formal and statists. So he was more interested in experimentation and provisional kind of city making, and that's where I got that word Urbanism Lite. The light essentially implies the ad hoc and provisional nature of different ideas we explore in our cities.
So tell me a little bit about, you had mentioned when we talked earlier the idea of public and private spaces. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, to tie that Urbanism Lite idea to public and private, so urbanism is actually like city making, anything related to city. So that kind of combines architecture, design, planning, public policy. So public and private spaces are kind of at that juncture, at that confluence where you look at people like in everyday activities. There is design involved, and there are professionals involved. There are bureaucrats involved. So there's like lots of stakeholders together, and that kind of got me interested into the subject. And specifically in this case, for this submission, I wanted to focus on privately owned public spaces. So the kind of spaces which are owned by a developer or a private entity, but they have opened it up for public use because city gave them a density bonus or some kind of a discount.
Mm-hmm.
And now they are trying to open that space up on the ground to the public for community. So that's something I'm now interested in, and that's what the essay is focused on.
What I love is, for someone who is in the aviation sector, which is arguably the team that deals with the largest projects that you can do, why is it that these spaces that are, I mean, they can just be a matter of feet between a curbside and the beginning of a building. What is it about that fascinates you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point actually, and it might be true in most cases. But if we look at big cities where, anyways, we have such a small public space, there have been many strategies in the past where they have created setbacks so that one gets more public space for public use. And to give you one very interesting example, very famous example actually, Seagram building by Mies van der Rohe, very famous architect, and everybody has seen that building. That building was one of the first buildings where the setback idea was explored. The city gave the developer extra floor space, and that kind of cleared up the ground for public use. And to add on to it, in 1979, William White, a famous architect and planner, he studied that public space with the old time-lapse camera. It's a beautiful study done on the behavior of people when the open space is utilized, how it's utilized, how the light affects the behavior and stuff like that. So I was really inspired by that study, and it still rings true in many of our public spaces, how they're utilized and how design affects the use of those spaces. So that was like kind of my impetus to start looking at these smaller spaces in between the buildings.
And this is something that, you know, while it's very obvious or very easy to apply it in a commercial setting where you have city planning, it's something that you look at putting into kind of all areas, all various sectors of architecture.
Yeah, I agree. And to go back to your airport analogy, I mean, we won't see the direct connection between how airports and cities would connect. I mean, they feel very detached. But I would say the airport in itself, it's such a big space. Once you're inside, it feels like a city. And if you look at hold rooms and circulation, the hold rooms are really private. There is a Southwest airline, there is American. So those are designed with completely different sensibilities, and the common spaces are designed with different ideas. And that kind of started me thinking the public-private relationship intensifying in the city itself. Firstly, I was working on a public project, so the level of finishes and the kind of choices we made were different. And then I was working on a private project, and that kind of gave me a perspective how I can start investigating this relationship. So that's where this idea of Urbanism Lite focused on privately owned public spaces came in.
I love that correlation. So tell me, I mean, why is that important? As a person walking down the street or inhabiting a city or taking a flight and going somewhere, why is having those spaces important?
Yeah, I think I would say when you said if it's a very small space between a building interface and street, the walk itself becomes really, really boring. There is no engagement, and that kind of I think creates an impediment for people to walk and kind of go on this healthy lifestyle where you would be interested in walking. And I think that experience of walking, engagement, and healthy lifestyle, in my view, goes hand in hand. It doesn't have to be these different things where sustainability is like about energy efficiency and your experiential parts are something different. I think they go really well if one has engaging streets where you want to walk on it, you want to look around, and maybe if you get tired, there is a place to sit. And that's even more relevant for somebody who is elderly or somebody who has kids. I think those things are even more intensified in that case when we think about the different age groups.
So tell me a little bit about the 4 cities you picked. You had New York, London, Paris, and Barcelona. Tell me a little bit about those 4 cities and why you picked them.
So New York, I have been to New York many times to meet my friends, and New York has really robust network and organization of privately owned public spaces. They have, I think, a governmental agency to look after that and to really check if those privately owned public spaces, how they are maintained, policed, and all that. So they have a really robust program. So I started visiting those places, like only once or twice I visited few of the famous places. And then I started investigating if there are any other cities who are doing similar things. They might not be exactly the same in exactly similar wording like in American context, but I could find lots of related references. Mm-hmm. So I would say New York and London have a very similar strategy to handle these spaces. So large public spaces where it's very hard for city to maintain them and police them. So they would start incentivizing the developers to start maintaining them. And the response is mixed, obviously. It's relatively controversial. So that's what I found in Paris and Barcelona, where the idea of public space is much more stringent. They don't like the whole private notion. So they have tried to maintain those public spaces very fiercely. So I think that was a choice. So I had New York and London and Paris and Barcelona. So there will be 2 categories in my mind. And actually going there would inform me how they actually function. So I don't know for sure right now how they actually work. But something to really look forward to when I go there.
So that was one of the things that I really liked, because you really have to go in the 4 elements that you laid out as part of your submission. You have to go to these spaces to experience them. So those 4 elements that you mentioned were behavior, taxonomy, organizational structure, and policy perception. Tell me a little bit about each one of those and how they kind of go into the overall design idea.
So these 4 criteria, I would treat them as a methodology to research all the 4 cities. So when I come back, I can present these 4 cities on a similar ground. So we have some kind of a comparison between these cities and how these public spaces are utilized. And to go over each of them real quick, behavior would be very simple, how people behave. And I have done that once in my thesis as well. What I would essentially do is click lots of photographs, people talking to each other, sitting, standing, loitering, smoking, all that, and then start tracing them and looking at patterns, how like basic habits, culture would affect how the public spaces are used. And that kind of, I think, will give us a glimpse in what is acceptable, what is not, and all those connotations which start with design and then reflected in how we behave in a space. And I think that kind of ties back to what Samantha was saying in her last podcast. She was saying about how the idea of spitting or smoking has changed over the period of time, and that kind of changed the design as well. Like, we don't see those infrastructure pieces in those public spaces. There is no trash, sorry, what's that called? The ashtrays. Yeah, ashtrays. I actually forgot about the ashtrays. We don't see them as much now. Yeah. And I think those would be amplified in case of COVID, because now the social distancing is such an important criteria there. So it will be fascinating to see when people start meeting each other, what happens in that personal sphere. Yeah. Do they handshake? Do they hug each other? I mean, this is something I'll be observing and like noting it down. So that would be interesting.
And you're going to be looking, it sounds like, at the behavior between the design, how it affects the people, but I would imagine there's a cultural element in there too, because the culture between Barcelona, Paris, London, and New York are all very distinctly different.
Agree, yeah. So that's the behavior bit. I would say taxonomy and organizational structure are more interiors and architecture oriented. So we are pretty familiar with that, making really rigorous drawings and understanding the structure and how it affects the ventilation, light, circulation in those spaces. So very pragmatic and bare bones of design I would study. I'll watch people walking through the spaces so that I get the circulation, like really noted it down in plain, in plan form, in sections, in perspectives. So those kind of drawings. So those are more.
Does furniture play into that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's why I created this spectrum. So behavior would start with people. So we would start observing people. Then it goes to the furniture and the smaller pieces, and then it starts going into how it is organized and how it shapes the space, and then overall architecture of that space, how it fits inside the buildings. Because in case of Paris, those are arcades. So arcades were designed as like space in between the buildings, and they were covered with these very beautiful glass, thin metal structures. So that kind of binds the whole experience, and then the architecture part is also very important in that sense.
And then tell me a little bit about policy perception.
Yeah, the fourth one is something which I haven't done before in any of my studies. So this is something new to me as well. The idea was to really look at smaller signifiers in public spaces, like a camera, like a CCTV camera or a signage, or a smaller indication in the design itself, which gives you a feeling of how this space should be used. And I'll document those signifiers. And what I really want to do in that is, there are two intents. There is an intent by the city, and there is an intent by the designer, and how it combines, and really we can see it happen in the public space. That is something I want to document. And in that case, the drawings won't be the best medium to express that. So I'll rely more on the newer digital technologies like time lapses and shorter videos, those kinds of formats.
So after you're done with all of this, and we'll get to the deliverable here in just a minute, but I'm really curious, like, do you have, because we're going to talk to you before you go and then after, do you have any kind of preconceived notions of how this will have an effect on your practice as a designer?
100%. I mean, I am interested in publications, making content for the presentations, videos. I think those are something, those are newer mediums. I mean, we are very familiar with drawings and prints and very traditional mediums. So I want to move a little bit into the newer ways to document and present our findings and designs. So that is something is there in back of my mind all the time when I'm doing these studies. So when I come back, I imagine me making a completely fresh way to present this whole study, something which I might not have done before. So I'll be exploring in those ideas as well.
One of the things I love that you've been talking about is not just the designer's intent, but how that relates to the implementation, and then also how that relates to the building as it takes on its own life and its own story after completion. Why is that third part important?
I would say whenever we look at a public space, what we are actually imagining is the final event, which kind of encapsulates all that experience. So maybe there is like a very vibrant protest or like a rally or a public speech by someone which was really instrumental in something, and then that picture really gives you the whole feeling of a space, that how it all adds up. So that kind of story I am interested in. I think that would make even our designs, when we design, we are, I think, designing for that interesting event maybe, and it might not be that famous event. It could be just two people meeting each other, or maybe a soldier coming back and meeting their family. Some of those things which are sometimes captured in those spaces.
Yeah.
And then you start looking at the whole environment around it, how it helped that to happen. So that's why the story is so important, I would say.
Well, so we mentioned it a little bit at the beginning, and you know, it is interesting to think of a travel competition in the midst of COVID, and even though things are starting to open a little bit, aside from the logistical part of being able to actually go and travel to these spaces and see it, how do you think COVID is going to affect the theory behind this?
Honestly, I'm kind of in two minds about it. I feel we are going to see like major change in behavior. That's what my gut feeling says. But that goes back to our culture discussion. There are cultures who are like really like close to each other, very close-knit communities. People know each other really well. So like doing handshakes and hugs are like so important to them. So I think it will be very hard to get away from. But some cultures who are relatively like subdued or not that expressive, they might be okay in this scenario, more introverted cultures. So that is something also I'm interested in looking at. I personally haven't been to London or Barcelona. I have been to New York and Paris once. So it will be interesting comparison to look at different cultures from COVID perspective. So yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Square. We'll put a link to Unmesh's submission down in the comments below. And we're really looking forward to, after you take this trip, being able to follow up with you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, contact information in the description below. If you're listening to the audio version of this, we've had various images from some of what Unmesh has been talking about in the video. So please make sure you go back and watch that video version of The Square. Until next time, thanks so much.